Here's the worst case scenario. Vladimir Putin, Vladimir Zelensky, and various other world leaders manage to establish a peace in Eastern Europe, and immediately Russia moves to take advantage. As Ukraine's exhausted, depleted fighting sons and daughters begin the painful work of reconstruction, the forces of Moscow prepare to make their move. Their tanks and troop carriers reconsolidate into newly armoured columns. Their poorly trained but battle-hardened conscripts spend a few months getting into true fighting shape. Before the year is out, Moscow is made ready for a new march on Kyiv. Its leaders and generals have learned the hard lessons of 2022 as they've narrowed the distance to Kyiv for a lightning offensive that'll be quicker and better executed this time, and they know that Ukraine is vulnerable in a moment that was promised as peace. With a truce between Ukraine and Russia now on the horizon, the Western world is working hard to build a plan for the aftermath and to prevent that dark vision we've laid out from ever becoming real. The answer, according to a growing chorus of voices in and out of Europe, will be a military one, with tens, if not hundreds of thousands of troops sent to take up positions and ensure that Russia dares not attack again. Whether it's a mutually agreed borderline, a demilitarized zone, or something else entirely, there will be a divide between Ukraine's territory and Russia's, and if Ukraine is to be defended, then somebody's got to turn that dividing line into a fortress. Apparently, it won't be America. Realistically, it can't be Ukraine alone, and if that job isn't left only to Ukrainians, then who? Well, let's get into it, shall we? For today's episode, we're going to make three key assumptions. Assumption number 1, Ukraine and Russia will establish a ceasefire in the near future. Assumption 2, after that ceasefire goes into effect, there will still be a sovereign nation called Ukraine, and it will still control some indeterminate amount of territory. And assumption number 3, regardless of whether we're referring to a standard national border or an empty no man's land as a buffer zone or even a Kremlin-backed puppet state in the Donbass, there will be some sort of territorial divide in Eastern Europe. That divide will feature Ukraine on one side and Russia on the other. Right now, NATO nations are learning a hard lesson within their own alliance, that the United States, under its current administration, has little intent of putting boots on the ground in a post-peace Ukraine. To illustrate that point, we'll pull a few quotes from America's new Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth. There will not be US troops deployed to Ukraine. Any security guarantee must be backed by capable European and non-European troops. They should be deployed as part of a non-NATO mission. Those quotes were pulled from Hegseth's remarks at NATO headquarters in Brussels in mid-February, and America's Secretary of State, its special envoy dealing with Ukraine and Russia, and its president have all made statements to a similar effect. In short, if Ukraine is going to be treated as a bulwark against Russian aggression in Europe, then that is European business, and it's Europe's responsibility. Now, that's a troubling prospect for European leaders who've emphasized to the US and the global public that American support, often referred to as a backstop, is critical to any attempts to maintain a buffer zone. American logistical capacity, intelligence and surveillance, tactical airlift and supply, and more are capabilities that Europe can't really match. French President Emmanuel Macron has described the idea of Europe deploying a large force by itself as, quote, far-fetched. Ukraine's foreign minister has insisted that, quote, any security guarantees are impossible without the Americans, and according to Western officials, major European leaders believe that any large-scale European force would need to be backed up by the US for credibility reasons. That US support is considered to be so important that some of those leaders may not authorize a deployment of their own troops without US involvement. Yet leaders all across the continent have been clear. Aggressive, expansionist Russia must be held at Ukraine, lest it launch an attack on a NATO member state, an attack that some on the continent suspect could be coming as soon as 2027. With fears rising that the United States may not even honor its commitment to NATO's collective defense, if things ever went that far, it becomes all the more important for Europe to protect Ukraine and to create conditions in which it would be more difficult or costly for Russia to attack. Every day that Russia decides not to restart the Ukraine war after a ceasefire is another day that Europe doesn't have to find out whether the promise of collective defense will hold. And the most potent method to deter any further Russian aggression is the same as we've already laid out. A strong, robust military force made up of people who Putin wants to fight less than he wants to fight Ukrainians, standing directly in the path that Russian forces would need to traverse. It can't just be a UN-style, under-equipped, basically token peacekeeping force either. As the former commanding general of US Army Europe put it in an event in January, quoting here, It has to be a real force so that the Russians know that if they ever tested it, that they would get crushed. And you can be sure that Russia will test it. End quote. So, as European officials start to build their approach toward what we're going to refer to, for simplicity's sake, as a Ukrainian Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ, this is the number one priority. Any international force present in that space must be a real deterrent against future Russian aggression. In addition to that, according to Western officials, there must be a real focus toward reassuring and building confidence within the Ukrainian state and among the population. Under a reliable security umbrella, Ukraine can do the hard work of reconstruction and can justify allowing its troops to leave the front to either rest and recover or move on to civilian life. With that, an international force must also be able to protect Ukrainian trade, commerce, and industry and create coverage that will allow Ukraine to rebuild critical infrastructure. Each of those tasks is a very important target for resource expenditure, but one that Ukraine could only really justify if it feels it doesn't have to spend those resources preparing for an imminent second invasion by Russian forces. The idea that European forces are going to simply strike a deal, shake hands, and flood troops into Ukraine is not a foregone conclusion. According to reports from an emergency meeting held in Paris on Monday, February 17th, following this year's Munich Security Conference, some of Europe's militarily capable nations, including Germany, Poland, and Italy, remain hesitant to endorse the idea. Those stances may change, especially in Germany, depending on the outcome of upcoming elections, which will have taken place by the time this episode is published. In any case, it's simply too early to report on concrete plans that just do not yet exist. It's too early to say that such a force would be organized under the auspices of NATO or draw on a similar separate group of European nations or something else entirely. What we can do, however, is discuss a deployment to a Ukrainian demilitarized zone in two ways: to evaluate what the priorities of such an operation would be, and to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses that European nations will have to account for. As we've laid out, the first priority for a mission to Ukraine is to deter any further Russian aggression, both against Ukraine and anywhere else in Europe. We mentioned NATO assessments a moment ago that Russia may choose to test the NATO alliance well before the end of this decade. To that end, it's worth noting that an overconcentration of European military capabilities in Ukraine may leave vulnerabilities elsewhere for Russia to probe against NATO directly, testing Article 5 at a moment when it's unclear whether the United States would honor its commitment to collective defense. A strong force in Ukraine, however, is a powerful deterrent to prevent any serious, large-scale act of aggression elsewhere, in the Baltics, for example, or in the high Arctic. Parking a few troops on an uninhabited island, for example, or flying a few explosive drones into Estonia or Latvia would be one thing, but for Russia to risk a full-scale military confrontation elsewhere while having done nothing about a combined European and Ukrainian force along its own border would be a clear and easily avoidable strategic misstep. In that same vein, it'll be incumbent on the nations of Europe to ensure that however their Ukraine force is ultimately structured, it can deploy and maintain a long-term presence there without overextending. Per Western officials, a major point of discussion at this stage is how to provide troops to Ukraine while ensuring that the Baltic states, Poland, Finland, and other nations in close proximity to Russia remain protected. European forces also have to worry about the rest of the continent, especially given the Russian sabotage operations that have been seen to be ongoing all across Europe in the last several years. At this time, Ukraine is not a NATO member and doesn't appear especially likely to become one in the near future. As such, a deployment of NATO forces into Ukraine simply cannot come at NATO's own expense. And just as important is a European force's ability to allow Ukraine to focus on reconstruction, not just because it's a nice thing to do, but because the sooner Ukraine is back on its own 2 feet, the sooner European nations get their own peace of mind in pulling back. As a result, it'll be critical for Europe to work out ways to protect not just Ukraine's borders, but the whole of the country. That includes shielding critical infrastructure from sabotage, protecting its defense industrial base from interference, ensuring that the safety of the country's leaders is not in question, and providing ordinary Ukrainians the safety and peace of mind that will allow them to get back to normal life. Alongside Europe's operational priorities is the question of what a deployed force would actually look like. And here, We'll start with troop numbers. A range of European and global sources have suggested that a very large ground force would be necessary to provide an effective deterrent. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has thrown out numbers between 100 and 200,000 European troops, and some of the continent's leading defense experts concur. Former NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen, who last served in the post in 2014, suggested that 50,000 troops would be required at a minimum, probably closer to 100,000. Those troops wouldn't necessarily all be on the front line at once. Quoting military strategist Lawrence Friedman here, speaking to the DW, "For every soldier, you need one in training and another recuperating. So my rough assessment is that overall, you need at least 100,000 troops." Lord Richard Dannett, former head of the British Army, gave the same estimate. But Western officials in the know, however, even the European nations that are more open to placing their own troops into Ukraine, are looking at numbers a good deal lower than that. In fact, a ground force might comprise somewhere under 30,000 troops, a far more modest allotment than either Zelensky or private defense experts have suggested. The reasoning behind a lower figure may, in part, reflect concerns that European nations couldn't scrape together 100,000 troops for such an operation, but there are pragmatic reasons to endorse a lower figure as well. Despite the battlefield prowess of European tanks and howitzers, it's not necessarily European ground forces that would be the most effective deterrent against Russian attack. Take the maritime dimension of battle, where the Russian Black Sea Fleet has long since been driven back to port and out of the range of Ukrainian sea drones. There, although Ukraine's own manned navy is dismal, European ships could make a massive difference in patrolling the Black Sea, securing critical trade routes in and out of Ukraine's southern ports, and spearheading operations to clear out sea mines. Taking British naval infantry as an example, a force of 1,200 British troops could equate to barely a battalion's worth of infantry, or it could be the number of troops required to staff up a pair of naval destroyers, a trio of frigates, a pair of mine countermeasure vessels, and a nuclear-powered submarine, all at once. That's just 1,200 troops from just one single contributing nation, and it's already enough to make a major difference in locking down the western half of the Black Sea. In the air, it's a similar situation, especially considering that even now, Russian military aircraft are exceptionally hesitant to fly within range of Ukrainian air defenses. With that airspace still contested, but largely empty of anything manned, it is a clear indicator that Russian air power is not ready to engage. Start placing Western air assets either in Ukraine proper or in border regions of countries like Romania or Poland, and those skies become even more difficult for Russia to even consider flying into. Looking at the question of manpower again, and this time using France as an example, a detachment of as few as 500 could represent some 4 fighter jet squadrons, collectively fielding dozens of copies of the French Rafale. That aircraft is multiple steps above anything in Russia's infantry, except perhaps its Su-57, a plane that has remained far from Ukraine's front lines. NATO nations could even leverage American-made F-35s as part of a DMZ operation, although that's something the United States could more easily oppose if it wished to, using its export controls as leverage and threatening to choke off the supply of replacement parts. The core thing to understand here is that European nations could get a whole lot farther in Ukraine by deploying troops in a smart way rather than simply deploying higher numbers in aggregate. There is, of course, value in having lots of troops on the ground, and there always will be, but when you start paying attention to the ratio of added value per troop deployed, you'll quickly notice that ground troops do not add the greatest value. For Russia to reinvade Ukraine with an advantage of the number of soldiers on the ground, but to be marching potentially hundreds of thousands of troops into airspace controlled by European air power would be suicide on a level that even the meat grinder assaults of Bakhmut couldn't match. Extend that advantage to naval power, to the deployment of sophisticated air defense systems and more, and a European force can make Ukraine utterly unpalatable for Russia to attack without sending 100,000 of their own troops to meet Russia on the open plains. And if you combine European military advantages on the ground with what should be a wider range of economic and diplomatic deterrents against Russian aggression, then hopefully those many disincentives taken together would be enough. And just as important is an international force's ability to work alongside Ukraine rather than simply doing their job alone. A European force could afford to focus on air and maritime capabilities, in part because the Ukrainian ground forces are perfectly capable of holding their own on the ground. According to Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukraine has 980,000 soldiers in active duty as of early 2025, and even assuming a combination of possible overcounts and the offer to return to civilian life could cut that number down massively, even a standing army of, say, 250,000 million, would be capable of rotating tens of thousands of men to the front line at any given time, especially since those troops would be in their home nation rather than a part of an international mission. Many of those troops will be experienced combat veterans with a deep familiarity with the areas they'd be deployed into, and Ukraine could even choose to take such an opportunity to add younger conscripts to the mix, dipping into a portion of its population in peacetime that has been deemed too small to risk drafting into war. Ukrainian capabilities will be available to an international force in other ways too. Manned naval power in the Black Sea would be able to operate alongside the sea drones that have proved such a menace to the Russian Navy, while Ukrainian anti-air tactics will make international troops considerably more capable of fighting an air war. Of course, potential Russian demands that Ukraine downsides its military could become a major obstacle here, but even a smaller Ukrainian force can help to offset the gap and create a meaningful deterrent. Add to that the potential to patrol and monitor remote borderlands with drones supplied by Ukraine's booming UAV industry, and the need for any large number of troops, let alone NATO forces on the front line, is drawn down substantially. Finally, there are the elements of any such force that will probably have to come from the Americans. The most important factor on that list is America's ability to provide a nuclear deterrent in a way that European nations simply cannot. Europe's two nuclear nations, Britain and France, lack both the aggregate number of nuclear warheads and the sufficient range of deployment and delivery mechanisms that would allow them to deter Russia all by themselves. They certainly get some of the way there, but not nearly with the effectiveness of America's massive nuclear arsenal. Other American assets, like the country's space-based intelligence gathering capabilities, would also offer something that Europe simply couldn't make up for some other way. But with a well-thought-out approach leveraging European capabilities to their fullest potential, a DMZ mission could conceivably address problems like logistics, combat air power, and more all by itself. It would certainly be helpful to leverage American capabilities in those areas, but Europe can do respectable work without leaning on Washington. That's not an ideal scenario, but it is a survivable one, and one that ensures that the United States isn't asked to deploy troops or other assets toward the front. In that scenario, the US may be more willing to provide nuclear intelligence sharing and logistical backstops that allow it to maintain a more passive or distant overall posture, while freely allowing the use of American hardware by other nations to keep the peace. Alright, so now that those challenges are dealt with, we can map out a rough approach that protects Ukraine, shrinks the overall number of European troops required to take part, and substantially reduces European reliance on the US. According to Western officials who've spoken to media on background, it's this general sort of approach that's under consideration right now. But although that approach addresses several problems at once, it also creates others. How can Europe balance the reality that not all nations will agree to take part? How can Europe minimize the possibility that a small skirmish, even a misunderstanding, would trigger an Article 5 response by the NATO alliance? And if you operate under the premise that forces deploying to Ukraine would be strictly European, are you ignoring alternatives that deserve to be explored? While the potential unwillingness of certain nations to participate and the risk of triggering an Article 5 response are two separate problems, they can be addressed through a common answer. Put simply, this troop deployment will be easier to accomplish if it's not arranged under the auspices of the NATO alliance, but is instead treated as a separate coalition of the willing. That coalition wouldn't operate as if NATO didn't exist. After all, its component nations would still be a part of the alliance, and strategic collaboration between NATO and this separate coalition should be a given. But in terms of its command and control structure, its forces on the ground, and its ability to solicit cooperation from the United States, a coalition can probably get a lot further if it's not formally under the NATO umbrella. In the process, such a group could create a limited loophole to deal with Article 5 violations, especially if that problem were openly discussed on the world stage and participating nations made clear what sort of engagements would or wouldn't be considered a NATO-style attack on one, thus an attack on all. For example, if a dozen Russian soldiers and a dozen coalition ones happen to run into each other on patrol and get into a firefight, well, it would be a real shame if we all had to have a nuclear war over that, wouldn't it? Acts of international aggression, or aggression of a certain scale toward troops hailing from NATO nations, may still trigger Article 5, and probably should. But greater flexibility in that regard means a greater likelihood of averting a crisis. Not only that, but a coalition of the willing could, by nature, leave out European nations that don't want to send troops. Poland, for example, has indicated that it's not willing to participate directly in such an effort, and so is Germany. Other NATO nations on the Russian border, like the tiny Baltics or Finland with its long remote border to patrol, would be able to focus on essential security matters closer to home. And each of those nations, even if they decline to participate militarily, would have the option of sending funds, non-lethal equipment, or other forms of support instead. And around the world, some experts have posited that just constraining a coalition to Europe could be a major misstep. Take a recent argument published via the outlet Foreign Policy, written by Namankar Thomas Habtom and entitled "The Global South, Not Europe, Should Play Peacekeeper in Ukraine." Habtom argues that, quote, putting NATO soldiers on the ground in front of armed Russians in what Moscow considers to be its militarized frontier does nothing to resolve the underlying tensions. Instead, it would exponentially increase the risk of a wider European war. It's a strong argument, even if it were to be somewhat mitigated by a coalition of the willing approach. As an alternative, Habtom notes a number of international peace proposals on Ukraine, spotlighting ones from Indonesia, Mexico, and a collection of African nations, and argues that troops from elsewhere around the world may be far better to draw upon as part of a peacekeeping force. If they happen to have neutral or even friendly ties with Russia, then even better. Attack them and Russia gives itself a new set of headaches to deal with. Habtom proposes what we'd refer to as a United Nations-style peacekeeping force, possibly not even a particularly large one, bringing together troops from across the world. Now, truthfully, there are a couple of critiques that will levy towards the base proposal. One, it operates on the shaky assumption that geopolitical consensus would stop Russia from steamrolling a smaller and less formidable peacekeeping force. Two, it ignores recent history in which UN-style peacekeeping forces are typically under-equipped, underprepared, and in essence, unable to actually keep the peace. But it does raise an interesting possibility for a hybrid force with both a European and a global element to be an even more effective deterrent to Russia. Take the European commitments that we highlighted previously. Lots of naval and air power, but not much in the way of ground forces. Shrink those ground forces down even further, though, because now that role can be handled by a mix of Ukrainian troops and global peacekeeping forces. Their lesser stocks of warfighting equipment are made irrelevant by the combination of Ukrainian and coalition hardware in the area, and any risk to their lives is mitigated by the fact that with their presence, they're creating an even more powerful deterrent. That's especially true if their forces draw on soldiers from BRICS nations or Russia-friendly states across several continents who can further add value to a much larger overall deterrent package. There's also the possibility that individual world nations, particularly major or regional powers, would step up on their own to take part. One such major power, China, was recently floated by the United States as a potential peacekeeper, but that's unlikely for several reasons. Not only would Russia-friendly China probably find its troops quite unwelcome on Ukrainian soil, but sending large forces to this sort of operation doesn't really align with how Beijing does business. Indeed, China's response to America's proposal was basically to avoid engaging in it, matching China's usual approach when it wants to politely say, thanks, but no thanks. Another rising power, Turkey, is an interesting one to include. It's both a NATO member and a nation with warmer, albeit still tense relations with Russia when compared to the rest of Europe. It's also got the aggregate numbers to be a big help, with the second largest standing military in all of NATO behind only the US. But Turkey's focused elsewhere, primarily on Syria, and it may not wish to navigate the additional headaches that would come with friction in its relationship with Moscow. Two other world nations, however, bear closer consideration: the rising powers of Brazil and India. Brazil was floated alongside China as a potential provider of peacekeeping troops, and the country has indicated that it's open to the idea, although recent political developments at home would suggest that Brazil may have its hands full for the near future. India is the really interesting prospect, since the deployment of peacekeepers would contribute to a wide range of India's own geopolitical goals. The country has worked hard to position itself as a potential peace broker in Ukraine, with Narendra Modi even visiting the country in mid-2024. India's historically been close with Russia, but has recently been looking to both assert its power as a growing international player and pursue a more neutral posture as a strategically non-aligned state. Not only that, but India's been working hard to modernize, expand, and deploy its military, launching an unprecedented security mission to the Red Sea starting in December 2023 to deal with the Houthi rebels and local pirates. Deploying to Ukraine would be an opportunity for thousands of its troops to pick up real-world experience in a different theater, learning from and operating alongside European forces, while New Delhi could operate as a collaborative but mediating influence on Europe and keep doors open with Moscow. From Europe's perspective, thousands of Indian troops would both help to build up a deterrent ground force and introduce a foreign nation that Russia would probably be far more hesitant to risk pissing off. India's slow process of distancing itself from Russia has been a problem for the Kremlin, and one that Putin certainly wouldn't want to make permanent. In the coming months, it appears increasingly likely that Ukraine and Russia will establish some sort of ceasefire agreement, and whenever that finally happens, a new countdown will begin. When the clock runs out, Russian troops will be back at it, rolling towards Kyiv or even making a direct challenge against the NATO alliance. It'll be up to European forces to stand in the gap, perhaps aided by a wide range of international partners, or perhaps forced to go it alone. The nature of the forces deployed in a Ukrainian DMZ, their capabilities, their allegiances, and their power will determine whether that countdown clock can be slowed or perhaps even frozen. Now, let's hope that Europe can figure this problem out and do it quickly. Every second counts when the countdown ends with war. Thank you for watching.